Almost all emergencies come unexpectedly. That is the nature of an emergency. You don't have to be a prepper to make preparations for emergencies. In fact, if you make basic preparations, like I'm going to be sharing in the next 3 videos, you'll have a little bit more peace of mind, you'll be better equipped to deal with the emergencies, and you'll be able to focus your energies on the things that really need your attention. But we are not preppers. We just have decided to make some prudent preparations. So these first 3 videos are going to be dealing with the basics of preparation that every family needs to have, regardless of what happens. And if no emergency comes, we'll have the supplies, we can use them, they won't go to waste. The first video is going to be focusing on heat, shelter, and power, things that we can do to be better prepared to meet those kinds of emergencies. The second video is going to be dealing with food and water preparations, and the third will be dealing with medical supplies, home supplies like basic things, and miscellaneous. So please be sure to check all the videos in this series, which will be coming out soon. And let's get started on prudent preparation for anyone. Hi folks, welcome back to my channel. It's Lori, and we are just going to dive right into prudent preparation measures that we can all take so that our family is better prepared. If we have a plan, if we can come up with alternative ways of dealing with things, we are just going to be so much better able to relax. We won't necessarily have to panic, and it's just, life is going to be better. Now, we have really noticed the need for alternate preparations in the wake of Hurricane Helene. I want to preface this whole talk by saying that I don't believe that any particular preparations would have helped the people who got affected in Hurricane Helene. We in this area of Upper East Tennessee have seen a lot of devastation. There have been a lot of interruptions, and for the people who lost so much of their property and house and even lives, it's not necessarily the preparations that would have saved them. Some people who lost power could have been a little bit better in a better place. But as far as would this storm have affected them, it probably still would have, if it was just kind of a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time when the storm hit. Because it's a strange thing that a hurricane hit Upper East Tennessee in the mountains of North Carolina. It's just a strange thing that happened. So I'm not here saying, oh, if we'd have been better prepared or whatever, the storm wouldn't have affected us. That's not true. And the people whose houses were swept away, because there were many, there were landslides and flooding, any preparations or any supplies, food that they had stored probably wouldn't have helped them. It just would have gotten wet. And so let's keep it all in balance. I'm not saying that because of people not being prepared, they were affected. That's not the case. Not the case at all. I'm just saying that there are going to be lots of emergencies that come sooner or later to all of us. It could be a hurricane, it could be a tornado, it could be a blizzard. We were interrupted last winter for at least 8 days when everything got knocked out, and we had no power, and we're even off grid. And so we had to figure out ways to beef up what we do, because we said that the snow can shut us down, and so a flood can shut us down. Electrical impulses can shut us all down. The power grid going down. These things, there are lots of things that are kind of unpredictable, that we don't know when they're coming, and that's why they're an emergency. So prudent preparation, I think, means doing what we can and then dealing with it when it comes. And so we're trying to do what we can little by little. I don't think that any of us need to feel the pressure to go get everything right now. But at the same time, the state of our country is a little bit volatile and it's a little bit unstable. So having a few things tucked away just is not a bad plan, in my opinion. I like to think of it as the long game of preparing. So if you're at the store, grab a few extras of X, Y, and Z. We are taking from the the experience that we have had living off grid for over 6 years. We lived 5.5 years in a camper with 5 of us to begin with cats and whatever, as we've been building on our property. And so we actually moved up on this property, like ready or not, here we come. And we were not ready. We didn't have water set up. We didn't have any kind of electricity set up. We just moved into our camper on raw land and said, we're going to figure it out. And so we have. It hasn't always been seamless, but we've figured it out. And so these things we can share with you because, you know, when you go through stuff, you have more things that you can share with other people. That's just the nature of it. In addition to our off-grid experience, I basically lived off-grid for a year in the Amazon, going up and down the river on a boat that occasionally we would fire up the generator if we needed lights at night, but largely we were off-grid and like in the middle of the jungle or in the middle of the Amazon River. So that was a different experience and definitely has affected me. It's definitely taught me a few things that I can implement even now. And my husband also has experience in third world countries where he has lived in Chile for some time. These things happened before we got married, but let me tell you, they still affect us, and they kind of have taught us that everything, you don't have to have everything that we actually expect here in America in order to get by. People get by with a lot less, and the things that we saw in those countries, actually, we have been able to implement some of those things, and it has made life a little bit easier to deal with because we realize that everybody in the world doesn't have the same luxuries that we do. If an emergency hits, and it will hit, where there will be an interruption in the power grid at some time, most of us here in America, and most of us all around, even around the world, we depend on electricity. We depend on the grid being working for everything that we expect in our lives. And so if the grid were to go down, or if a storm were to come through and knock the power out, or if a tree would fall on the power line down the road, which you know that happens, what are we going to do when the power goes out? What are we going to do? How are we going to live? Especially if it's cold, how are we going to take care of our family? These things are really important to think about. So I would encourage you to, as you listen and as you research, do your own research, start making a plan, start writing things down, and think, how can we implement this for our family in our situation where we live? Maybe you live in a hot state and maybe you live in a cold state. So there's different things that are going to apply to your situation that don't apply to ours. We live in Upper East Tennessee, where we have winters, we have all 4 seasons. Shelter is at the top of the list. Shelter protects you from those who are without, which may be other people, it may be animals, whatever, but it also keeps you warm, and it gives you a place where you can keep your stuff. So having a shelter is really important. Most people depend on having like a home. If your home gets knocked out, then what is your alternate shelter going to be? And we can't always prepare for every emergency as far as shelter. We can try to remove trees around our dwelling to make sure that they're not going to fall on our house if a wind comes, but sometimes our shelters are affected. So most people don't have the luxury of actually having an alternate shelter. If you have that, great. If you have a storm shelter, you're way more prepared than most people. In the very least, a lot of us, we may have to grab a tent to live in, and that's what a lot of people still are doing in the mountains of North Carolina, and it's really, really hard. And so if you have to have that, you're going to want blankets, and you're going to want a way to keep warm in that shelter. A car can be a shelter. You can take a tarp and rope and fashion it in the trees. We've learned that in Scouts and Pathfinders, that is a thing that we can do. But obviously the most permanent shelter is going to be our house. And so hopefully we are going to be, if there's an emergency that comes, hopefully we'll be able to be in our house. If not, we might want to have some kind of supplies in our cars that we can grab quickly. And if we need to live in those for a shelter from the rain and the heat or the cold, then that is going to be something that we're going to do. But I'm mostly assuming that we're still going to have our houses, just in a different way. So a shelter, once we have that taken care of, we're going to want some way to heat that shelter. And I would say most of the people in our country are dependent on electric heat, electric lights, things like that to heat their home. So what are you going to do if you are dependent on electricity, but that goes out? What are you going to do? How are you going to heat your home? I would recommend thinking about another source. And there's a couple of prime ones that I can think of that work really well, but you actually have to prepare ahead of time if you're going to have any one of these things. So the most basic one that I can think of is unless you have like a fireplace, an open fireplace, which they're not that efficient at keeping your house warm. So the most basic and probably the most economical is to get just a wood stove that you can gather wood from around your property if you're blessed with trees, or you can buy wood or pellets or even coal in some areas. So a wood stove or some kind of a stove like that is going to be it's going to be a blessing to you if you have access to that. That's going to be something that you can't just grab in a pinch, because let me tell you, installing the chimney, making sure it goes through your wall, having it work and knowing how to work it is kind of part of your preparation. So if you're going to be relying on a wood stove for your backup heat source or your primary heat source, get to know it. Get to learn how much wood it takes, what kind of wood it takes, because believe it or not, you don't just grab any kind of wood. Some will be more apt to gum up your chimney, like pine. Some are going to burn hotter, some are going to burn longer. And so it's really good to think about these things, try to learn everything you can before there is a crisis. Have the supplies that you need. If you're going to heat with wood, you're going to need something to split it. You're going to need a pretty good supply, and it's going to have to be dry. So yeah, lots of things to think about. You're going to need kindling. You're going to have a way to start it, whether that's going to be a lot of matches or the flicking torches, or the long lighter sticks. There's lots of ways to light it, but having several of those things so that in case one doesn't work, then you could rely on the next one. Those are going to be really, really important. And then some people want to use like fire starters. You can get the fat wood, or the Ritchie wood as they call it around here, or you can make your own fire starters with dryer lint and paraffin wax or various things. Sometimes we'll use sawdust and diesel, sprinkle a little bit of that, and it helps the fire to get started a lot quicker. So think about what are you going to need to make your wood stove go? And do you have the supplies for that? Do you have the manpower? Do you have the ability to make that happen? Or that may not be an option for you. Okay, so another alternate heat source is like a little propane stove. You can get propane logs, you can get natural gas logs, you can have a freestanding gas or propane fireplace. Those things work really well for heating. You have to think about, is it going to go through the ductwork, or is it just going to be like a localized place? And if it's going to be localized, then are you going to need to like set up an area of your house that you're just going to live in that area, so that you're not trying to heat the whole entire house? That can be something that is good to think about. So if you're going to have like small heaters around, think about how you're going to most efficiently use them. One thing that they've been calling for that really are useful, they've been calling for taking these to the mountains of North Carolina, where people still do not have power, even 3 and more weeks later. Mr. Buddy heaters. They're just small heaters that hook up to a propane grill tank, and they're very portable, but they work really well. They're really nice and warm. Any kind of warmth is very welcome. So if you're going to use one of those, they're not that expensive. So you have to think about venting. Are you going to be able to vent those in your house? And then do you have enough propane stored? Do you need to get tanks filled up? You can grab the grill tanks. But if there's a true emergency, you're not going to be able to go buy those things in the emergency, because everybody else is going to be doing that. So that's kind of something you have to start thinking about. Do you have something that's already prepared that you can just have it in the back of your wherever you store things, and then you can just grab it in a pinch? So I would recommend thinking through, how are you going to heat your home if you don't have power? And think through all the things you're going to need in order to make these things work. Well, another way to think about for heating is, do you have enough blankets that if it was colder than you're used to, can you pile them up? Do you have a source? And if you're not at home, if you're stuck in the car somewhere, do you have one of those emergency blankets that you can like have in your car to keep warm and conserve your heat, because you're not always at home when an emergency hits. So we have shelter and we have heat, and then we kind of danced around an alternate power source, but let's just dive into that. What are you going to do? How are you going to have lights? How are you going to make the things work in your house? Are you going to be able to cook? Are you going to be able to run your appliances? So if you're dependent on power, which most people are, what are you going to do? So there's a few options. One of them, probably the easiest, but it can cost you some money, is to have a backup generator. And so you can get generators from pretty cheap on up to several thousands of dollars. The bigger they are, the more they're going to power. But running a generator is not the most efficient way to power your house. It costs a lot of money to run a generator, and you're going to have gas. And so do you have enough? If you have a generator, do you have gas that has been stored, or are you dependent on going to the gas station? And again, in an emergency, if people cannot get transportation through, then the gas stations may not be filling up with gas, and so you're going to have to think about that. So it's going to be better to have at least a little bit of gas if you're going to run a generator or whatever it's going to power your generator. A lot of times it's gas. It could be propane or another source, but most of them run on gas. And then if you're going to store the gas, you probably need to put some type of treatment in it if you're going to store it for a little bit longer than than is usually recommended, which is, I don't know, a couple months maybe before it starts to get funky. I'm not sure exactly what gas does, but I know that there's some treatment that you have to put in it if you're going to store it long term. Alternate power source is important as far as your appliances. So if you don't have a way to power your appliances through some type of generator, how will you cook? Do you have a little camp stove? And if you have a camp stove, do you have the little tank, the little grill tanks that go onto that? So think all these things through, because power, we kind of take our power for granted, but our power does so many things in our home. Our power gives us the ability to keep our food fresh, like our refrigerator and freezer. So if you don't have power, I would recommend first start eating the things out of the fridge, and then as time goes on, then move on to the things in the freezer, and then at least you're not going to have food that is spoiling, hopefully, and then you can move on to your like cans and whatnot. But we're going to be talking about food in the next video, but I'm just thinking about all the appliances that are dependent on power. Having a small way to heat things, like to boil water, is going to be really important. In a camp stove, it's not recommended that you use that inside, so you might have to take that out on a porch or outside. You can use one of the camping like burners. You can take that outside and they're very efficient. But lights, what are you going to do if you don't have lights? Are you going to have flashlights? And if you have flashlights, you need batteries. And having rechargeable batteries is great. But if you can't recharge them, then you might want to have some that are not rechargeable, and just keep them on hand. Don't store them in your flashlight. And another thing that we need to consider is our power. A lot of times, if you're on a well, then your power is giving you the ability to get water from that well. So we're going to talk about that when we talk about water. But think about even having a generator that can power your well pump. That is going to be a really good recommendation. We have a well pump that actually our backup is solar, so we can operate our well pump on solar. But every system has interruptions. We could definitely get an interruption, and then we would be also in a pinch. So, having a backup of that, we don't have a hand pump yet, but it would be very advisable for us and for you, if you have a well, to get a hand pump where you can actually pump the water out and get water, and then you're not dependent on power to get that out. One more thing that I want to recommend is that you think about having an alternate communication method, because we saw it with Helene, especially in Asheville, the situation was really bad. The people had their cell phones, but they could not communicate. remember if the cell towers were jammed up, but they were all down and they could not communicate. It was a couple days before they could even get the phone calls out or texts or anything. And so EMS workers were not able to communicate with the outside world. And so our cell phones are dependent on power, and they are dependent on the power grid being up and running. And so, I mean, we can use our cell phones without power, but we have to be able to charge them. And so we can charge them in our cars if we need to, but that's just assuming that we have gas in our cars. If we don't have gas in our cars, then we're going to have to think about some way that we can charge our cell phones so that we can get communication if there's, if there's the internet and all that. If there's not, then we're going to be in a pinch. And so in that case, there are radios, there are shortwave radios, ham radios, different ways that we can connect with the outside world, so to speak. And so those things we need to think about, because getting communication, finding out what's going on is really important. In our town, we needed to know which bridges were out. We needed to know which roads were closed down and which ones had been flooded, and because we didn't want to drive into a situation that was going to lead to danger. And so having communication, just to even hear updates on the water situation and so forth, just really important to be able to have communication. We have these little battery packs. I don't have one with me. They go on like we have these Cobalt, have the power tool battery. And then there's a little charger thing that slides on it that you can actually power your cell phone. You can charge it with those. And so we used those for many, many, many years. In fact, the whole 5.5 years that we were in the camper, that's what we used for charging our phones. We didn't really charge them into the wall because that would require us running the generator, and we rarely were running the generator. So we would charge the batteries and then plug our phones into those. And we just got used to it. There's lots of things that you can do. There's like battery packs that have like the all-in-one. So there's lots of different things that you can get. And in fact, Andrew has a little, it's like this big, it's just a little power pack, and he can charge his phone from it. He has to charge it. And so that is, he has to figure out a way to charge it if there's no power. That can be charged in the car. There's also some that actually are powered by solar, and then there's some that you can crank. And so there's little radios that you can get that are hand cranked or solar powered. And so I would look into those. There's so many examples that you just kind of have to poke around on the internet to find out what kind you think is going to work best for you and what features you want. I would personally probably want one that I could charge by solar and that would power my phone, and that would probably charge something else up, and probably have a radio on it as well, so that I could hear communications of what's going on. Shelter, heat, and power. These are three very important things that we have talked about, and I hope that this will just kind of start sparking your thoughts in the way of thinking, what can I do? What could I do for my family? And what do I need to research so that we are better prepared for an emergency? Please be on the lookout for part 2, in which we discuss food and water preparation. We're going to be getting into a little bit of stuff that we mostly think about when we think about prepping. And remember, we are not preppers. We're just people who are trying to do the best we can and help you think about things that you could do for your family. This is all for today, and until we see you next time, be safe, be well, and God bless you.